This is Flare and Flow by The Legend of Chell on AO3. Chapter 10, Currents. Although they had decided to visit the Blue Lion next, Allura insisted they stop by the Northern Air Temple first, to update the monks on their progress. It wasn't really out of the way, and Keith had promised to go there once they found Cheryl, so everyone agreed to the detour. They all stared in awe at the architecture built into the peak of the mountain. Several spires seemed to grow out of the rocks itself, with no visible access point below. Clearly, the only way in was to fly. The sky was filled with sky bison and airbenders gliding on their staffs. They touched down in a large courtyard to find a figure already waiting. "Father!" Allura cried joyously. With a gust of wind, she gracefully floated down from the head of Platt's saddle and into his arms. "I missed you so much," she said. "How's Mother?" Alfor laughed. "She is well, Allura. I missed you too." Allura pulled back and shot her friend a smile. "Everyone, this is my father, Monk Alfor, leader of the airbenders." They all exchanged greetings. Alfor's gaze, so similar to Allura's, landed on Keith. "Avatar Keith." He pressed a fist into the flat of his palm and gave a small bow. "Thank you for coming and offering your help. I can't tell you how relieved we all were when we heard the Avatar had been found at last." "Oh, of course." Keith hastily bowed back. "I'll do everything I can to find the White Lion." Alfor straightened up with a nod. "Let's not delay then. Allura can show you all to where you'll be sleeping for the duration of your stay. And once you've settled in, I'll take you to the lion's den." They followed Allura to their rooms and idly listened to Karan's history lesson about the temple. The structure itself was quite large, understandable since it hosted several airbenders, so they were assigned rooms in pairs. Keith would bunk with Cheryl, Lance with Hunk, and Pidge with Allura. Karan apparently had his own quarters, as this was his home temple. After dropping off his meager belongings, Keith bid his friends farewell and followed Allura to meet Alfor in the lion's den. The den itself was a large room, plain except for the murals that decorated every wall. Keith gazed admiringly at the various depictions of the White Lion's deeds throughout history. "Since we are nomadic people, the White Lion has a den in each of the 4 air temples," Alfor explained. "This was the one she occupied last before her disappearance, so it probably has the best chance of any lingering clues." "What exactly happened when the White Lion disappeared?" Keith asked. His fingers lightly brushed a particularly stunning image of the White Lion roaring a tornado of wind. Alfor's eyes darkened. "It happened without warning. Everything was fine. The White Lion watched over us. The people were happy. And then she was just gone. Vanished in the night." "And you think someone stole her?" Keith asked. "I don't see any other explanation," Alfor replied, "although there were no signs of any sort of break-in. Trust me when I say the White Lion would not have abandoned us of her own will." "If someone did kidnap the lion," Keith said, "do you have any idea of who might be responsible?" Alfor hesitated. Allura opened her mouth, but Alfor shot her a look. She closed her mouth and glared at the ground. Keith watched its exchange with furrowed eyebrows. "What?" Keith asked. Alfor sighed. "Allura has a theory," Alfor said. "One I am reluctant to agree with." "But it makes sense," Allura blurted out. "Why did Fire Lord Zarkon work so hard to ruin your reputation? So that everyone would think the White Lion left because you gave her too much freedom instead of considering an outside part—" "That's enough, Allura," Alfor said firmly. "We've discussed this numerous times. I know you distrust Zarkon, but there is no proof he was involved in any way." "It's not just me. Even the Earth Queen suspects him." Allura shot at Keith an imploring look. Keith nodded. "That's true. She said so herself." Alfor sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. "I know you mean well, Allura," he said calmly, "but accusing Fire Lord Zarkon without any evidence to back up your claims won't help us. So until we find some, let's just focus on the original plan." Allura pursed her lips but nodded sullenly. The head monk led Keith to the middle of the room where the pallet, resembling some kind of nest, was embedded into the floor. "This is where the White Lion slept. Perhaps you should sit here to meditate. If nothing else, it's much softer than the ground." Alfor chuckled. Keith nodded and sat down on the mattress in the lotus position. The 2 airbenders exited the room with the promise that they'd be right outside if Keith needed anything. Keith closed his eyes and focused on expanding his senses. Even though the White Lion hadn't been there in years, the den had been so imbued with her aura that Keith could sense the tiniest amount still present. Latching onto it, Keith threw his awareness out as far as he could, searching for anything that resembled the energy. What felt like hours passed. Keith was just about to give up when a faint trickle caught his attention, like something was trying to reach out to him from beyond the thick barrier. Keith tried to Keith tried to go toward the energy, but it vanished as quickly as it had come, and no matter what Keith did, he couldn't find it again. With a sigh, Keith drew himself back into his body and walked out of the den. Judging by the setting sun, he'd been there for most of the day. Allura jumped up from her seat on the ground and hurried over to Keith with eager eyes. "Did you find anything?" she asked. "Not much," Keith answered. "All I really got is that the white line is still in the physical world, but I don't know where." Allura wilted, and Alfor placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "That's still more than we had." Alfor smiled. "Thank you, Avatar." "I'll try again tomorrow," Keith promised. Keith's next attempt was no more successful. Alfor remained in high spirits, but Keith felt like he was failing his duty. Alfor suggested Keith take a walk around the temple grounds to clear his mind, and Keith soon found himself sitting in the lovely Zen garden. He tried to let the calming swirls of the rock pattern soothe him, but he couldn't seem to shake the dark cloud hovering over his head. Keith was still brooding when Lance found him. "Hey, there you are." The waterbender sat down next to him. As he took in Keith's expression, his grin fell away. "You okay?" "Not really," Keith sighed. "I just spent all morning and most of yesterday trying to make some sort of connection to the white line. And what do I have to show for it? Nothing." "Well, that's unfortunate, but not really surprising. The white line hasn't been here in a decade, so of course you're having trouble. But I bet once you meet the blue lion, you can use her to establish a connection." "Maybe." Lance pouted at Keith's less than enthusiastic response before his eyes suddenly lit up. "I know what'll cheer you up." Lance hopped to his feet and grabbed Keith's wrist. "Follow me." He dragged Keith through the temple and back outside to another area that looked like some sort of courtyard. Sitting on the bench, Hunk was chatting with an airbender with long blonde hair. "Hey, Ramel." Lance waved a free hand. The airbender glanced up and waved back. As they drew closer, Keith saw that she was about their age and didn't have her tattoos yet, though from what he understood, that was pretty normal, and Allura was an outlier. "Keith, this is Hunk's new best friend, Ramel," Lance said, ignoring Hunk's hey, as Keith and Ramel exchanged greetings. "Ramel, I was wondering if you could teach Keith to use an airbender staff to fly. I'd ask Allura, but she looked pretty busy catching up with her dad." Keith shot a surprised look at Lance, and Ramel smiled. "Of course, it would be an honor." "Great." Lance grinned, and ushered Keith to follow her. Between Lance's excitement and Ramel's rapid-fire instructions, Keith barely had time to register what was happening before he was suddenly standing at the edge of a wooden landing, staff in hand. "Does that all make sense?" Ramel asked. I think so." "Don't worry. Should you fall, one of the sky bisons will catch you," she assured him. Keith peered over the edge. He had never been afraid of heights. In fact, he loved them, but even Keith had to admit it was an awfully long way down. He glanced back at his friends, Hunk and Ramel both giving him an encouraging thumbs up, and Lance shot Keith a dazzling grin and a wink. Keith took a deep breath and leapt off the landing. He took a second to enjoy the tug of gravity on his gut before pressing the mechanism Ramel had shown him. The staff unfolded into two sets of orange, fan-like wings, and Keith felt another swoop in his stomach as the air currents pushed him back up. A wide grin spread across Keith's face as he soared through the sky. Cheers rang out from below, and Keith looked down to see all his friends waving happily. Smirking, Keith spun into a barrel roll, followed by some loop-the-loops. His audience oohed and awed as he attempted increasingly daring tricks. Once he felt satisfied, Keith slowed down into a graceful glide, closing his eyes to fully feel the wind and sun on his face. For the first time, he felt truly happy to be the Avatar. When Keith finally drifted back down into the courtyard, the others surrounded him excitedly. "You are a natural," Ramel exclaimed. "Most airbenders take months to learn moves like that. Are you sure you were born in the Fire Nation?" "Honestly, once I was in the air, it just felt right, you know?" Keith admitted, "and it definitely did more to clear my head than walking or meditating ever has. Thank you." Keith turned to Lance. "And thank you for thinking of this, Lance," he said. "It really did help." "Anytime, man." Lance's grin became wistful as he looked back at the airbenders and still in the sky. "I just wish I could have joined you." As Keith glanced between the waterbender and the flying monks, the spark of an idea started to form. Keith tracked down Hunk and Ramel the following day to tell him about his plan. "Do you think it's possible?" he asked. The two exchanged looks. "Theoretically, yes," Hunk said, rubbing his chin. "But it would take a lot of work, and we're only here for a few more days. I'm not sure I'd be able to make something like that so quickly." "Oh," Keith tried to quash the disappointment in his chest. Hunk may have been a genius at building stuff, but Keith understood this was asking a lot. Hunk, however, pricked up. Oh, but I bet if I just tweak the designs that already exist instead of making new ones from scratch, that'd be way easier and faster. He turned to Ramel. Do you think the monks would let me look at some of the schematics for the staffs? Ramel tilted her head thoughtfully. I'm not sure the schematics are written down, but I bet if you ask Karan, he'd show you how we make them. Even better. Hunk turned back to Keith. I'll see what I can do and let you know. Keith smiled. Thank you, Hunk. Of course, anything for Lance. Keith felt his face heat up under the knowing looks from not only Hunk but also Ramel. Clearly Lance hadn't been joking when he'd said they'd become fast friends. Still, Keith averted his eyes and said, how did you know it's for Lance? You're not that subtle, dude. Hunk laughed, not unkindly. Plus, I've known him since we were kids. He's always wanted to fly, and if you make that happen, I'm pretty sure he'll propose on the spot. Keith's brain shut down after that, so he fumbled through a goodbye, thanking him again, and made his way back to his room. Cheryl looked up as Keith flopped face first into his mattress. You okay? Keith whined into the pillow. Okay, just making sure. The day before they were set to leave, Keith nervously approached Lance. The waterbender had been playing with some of the younger airbenders, but their game seemed to be over as the children trickled away. Lance raised his arms above his head to stretch and smiled when he saw Keith walking toward him. Hey, Keith, he greeted. What's up? Lance looked down curiously at Keith's hand, which the Avatar realized was fiddling with the hem of his red tunic. Keith quickly clasped both hands behind his back and cleared his throat. Actually, I wanted to show you something, he said. Lance grinned. Oh, yeah? Is this a date? Keith flushed and mumbled something under his breath. What? I said. Keith blushed harder. If you want it to be. Lance blinked, but quickly nodded. Yeah, yes, I do want that, he said awkwardly. Conversely, Keith felt some of his own shyness dissipate. Okay, but on one condition. You have to keep your eyes closed until I tell you to open them. What? Why? It's a surprise. Keith paused coyly. Unless you don't want to go on a date. Lance quickly slapped his hands over his eyes. Ow. Keith huffed out a small laugh and reached up to gently pry one hand away from Lance's face. He wove their fingers together so he could lead the other boy to the courtyard where Keith had met Ramel. Okay, you can look now. Lance opened his eyes and gaped. Sitting in the middle of the courtyard was a large glider. It resembled an airbender staff with its wings out, but the cloth was more rectangular shaped and didn't collapse back into the frame. There was also a bar that hung parallel to the wings and that the rider could hold on to. Hunk made it, Keith explained. You can fly even without airbending. Isn't it amazing? Oh, and it's perfectly safe. He hastily added when Lance merely stared. Ramel and I both tried it out, and even if something did go wrong, there are plenty of sky bisons around who would catch you. Lance still didn't respond. Lance? Keith peeked up at him hesitantly. Are you crying? No. Lance whipped around away from Keith and scrubbed his eyes. Keith smiled. You want to give it a try? Lance nodded, and Keith explained how the glider worked, positioning the waterbender so his hands gripped the bar. Once you're in the air currents will keep you aloft. You'll just have to shift your center of gravity to steer. So what you're saying, Lance grinned, is it's all about flow. Keith rolled his eyes but nodded. Ready? Let's do this. Lance's blue eyes narrowed in focus as he took off at a run. Keith's heart stopped as Lance plummeted off the landing before starting up again when the waterbender ascended with a joyful whoop. Grabbing his own borrowed airbender staff, Keith jumped off the ledge to join him. They spent some time soaring lazily around as Lance got his bearings. Once he decided he had a handle on the glider, Lance challenged Keith to a race around the temple's perimeter. Keith won, of course. No fair, Lance shouted. You used airbending. If I don't use airbending, I can't fly at all, Keith retorted. Lance grumbled, but quickly changed the subject by asking Keith to show him how to do a loop-de-loop. Lance's triumphant laughter kindled a warm glow in Keith's chest. After a while, they started to get tired and decided to drift back down to the courtyard. As soon as his boots touched the soft grass, Lance grabbed Keith's face and crushed their lips together. Keith stiffened in surprise, but quickly melted into the touch. Closing his eyes, Keith gripped the front of Lance's tunic and allowed Lance to tilt his head back for a better angle. Lance didn't propose that night, but he did kiss the life out of Keith. The next morning, Keith and his friends packed up their belongings to load onto Platt's saddle. Alfor, Rumel, and a handful of other airbenders came to see them off. "Thank you again for your help, Avatar Keith," Alfor said. "I just wish I could have been more useful," replied Keith. He had meditated in the lion's den every day, but never found any other leads. Alfred just shook his head. Just knowing the white lion is still out there somewhere is a comfort. For years we had found nothing and feared she was beyond our reach. But you have given us new hope. He offered Keith an encouraging smile. "I have every confidence that you and Alora will find her." Unsure how to respond, Keith merely nodded. "Before you go, there is one more thing." Alfred gestured, and a monk hurried over with an airbender staff. Alfred presented it to Keith. "Ramel tells me you are quite good with one of these. Traditionally, only airbender avatars have wielded them, but I think that's been more their preference than anything else. You're under no obligation to use it, of course, but we'd be honored if you would accept it." Keith gingerly took the staff with wide eyes. He pressed the small latch to reveal wings of crimson red instead of orange. Folding them back in, Keith clutched the staff close to his chest and gave the head monk a small bow. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'll treasure it always." Alfor bowed back and then turned to Hunk, to the earthbender's surprise. "Ramel also told me about your invention. I'll admit, since all air nomads can airbend, it never even occurred to us to make gliders for those without the ability." "Oh," Hunk wrung his hands in anxiety. "I'm sorry, I didn't know it was like a sacred thing." No. Alfor waved his hand with a laugh. "I think it's grand. In fact, I was wondering if you'd be willing to lend us your blueprints so we might make more. I'm sure they would come in handy." "Oh," Hunk blinked. "Yeah, of course. Thank you." Alfor offered Hunk a bow, which the earthbender returned with a baffled expression. Everyone said the last of their goodbyes. Alora and Karan understandably had the most, though Lance was trapped in a small ocean of children for a while. Ramel made Hunk promise to write to her. Once he finally escaped, Lance settled down in the saddle next to Keith and held out an arm so the avatar could curl into his side. Alora flicked the reins with a yip-yip, and they were off. About halfway to the North Pole, Karan came down with something called the slipperies. He assured them all that it wasn't life-threatening, but it was gross, so everyone gave their mucus-ridden friend a wide berth. When Karan's condition didn't improve after a few days, he requested they search for a special berry that would help fight the virus. It's a bit rare, but we just happen to be near the Hybra Mountains, one of the few places where these berries are known to grow, he said, through the handkerchief that had become permanently attached to his nose. "They're quite distinct, so you should be able to spot them easily. The berries themselves are dark purple, but the rest of the plant is stark white. The leaves grow in a unique crescent moon shape." He paused to blow his nose and added, "Watch out for thorns." And so, the following morning, they left Karan at camp and made their way up the mountain. Hyberia was huge and covered in a thin layer of snow, which wasn't surprising this far north. It would make finding the white plant much more difficult, though. "We should split up," suggested Pidge. "We'll cover more ground that way." They agreed to regroup around lunchtime, set off in different directions. As Keith trekked up his chosen path, he hunched over the small fire cupped in his hands. It was the middle of summer, which was probably why the snow was only a few inches deep rather than a few feet, but it was still cold. Keith made a mental note to get Alora or Karan to teach him the airbending trick to let them control their body temperature. He soon came to a more heavily forested area where the crowded trees provided a canopy over the snow-free ground. Seeing the abundance of flora, Keith shuffled in between the trunks, keeping an eye out for purple berries. His hunch paid off when about 15 minutes later he spotted what looked like the white vines in the distance. Keith hurried over and crouched down to inspect the plant. Purple berries and crescent moon leaves. With a smile, Keith began to pick several of the fruits and place them in his pouch. Rustle. Keith froze. Rustle, rustle. Eyeing the nearby bush where the sounds were coming from, Keith slowly rose to his feet and reached behind himself to draw his blade from its sheath. He held his breath as the rustling grew louder. The leaves finally parted to reveal a celestial wolf? Keith's eyes widened. Celestial wolves were magical creatures akin to the dragons, and just as rare. More commonly known as star wolves, they were said to be molded from the night sky itself. And this one wasn't even a full-grown star wolf, but a pup, probably only a few weeks old. The pup looked up at Keith and tilted its head. Keith looked back and mirrored the movement with his own head. It didn't seem hostile, so Keith put away his knife. Cautiously, he kneeled down. "Hello?" Keith greeted softly. The starwolf pup blinked up at him. It was a cute thing, with a dark coat and long, fluffy blue-gray fur that ran along its back and tail. White markings adorned its face and chest, and its eyes glowed bright yellow. "What are you doing out here all alone?" he asked. "Where's your family?" The pup merely tilted its head the other way. Keith dug into his pouch for a small piece of dried meat he brought for lunch and held it out. "Are you hungry?" The wolf pup padded closer and sniffed the offering cautiously. Keith's worry that it might bite him was quickly assuaged when the pup merely took the treat and hunkered down. Keith watched with a small smile as it held the meat under his paws, tearing at it with sharp teeth. Feeling braver, he slowly reached out a hand. The pup glanced up, and Keith paused, worried it might see his movement as a threat, but the pup went back to its meal. Hardened by this, Keith gently pet the wolf pup's head. It was so soft. Keith continued his ministrations as the pup finished eating it and lightly scratched behind its ears. The pup nuzzled into the touch, and Keith about melted on the spot. A low growl brought both Keith and the wolf pup to attention. "That's not your family, is it?" Keith asked warily. The pup raised its hackles and bared its fangs. Keith pulled out his own weapon. "Yeah, didn't think so." A large tiger boar leapt out from behind a shrub. Its beady eyes gave the avatar a considering look before turning to the wolf pup, apparently deciding the pup would make an easier meal. The tiger boar charged. The wolf pup stood its ground with a comically tiny snarl of its own. Keith could appreciate the sentiment, but the tiger boar was at least 5 times bigger than the pup, so he snatched it out of harm's way. Arms full of confused magic canine, Keith booked it. The tiger boar angrily gave chase, and Keith cursed under his breath. It was a lot faster than it looked. Realizing he couldn't outrun the beast, Keith hastily set the pup down and spun around to blast a plume of fire. The tiger boar reared back with a screech. It stared at them through the wall of flames for a long moment before turning to slink away. Keith let out a sigh of relief and looked down at the wolf pup. "Well, that was fun," he said dryly. He glanced up at the sky to gauge the sun's position. It was almost time to meet up with the others. Crouching down, he gave the pup one last pat. "Stay out of trouble, okay? Don't go picking fights until you get a little bigger." When the pup just blinked back up at him, Keith stood and set off. At the sound of rustling, Keith turned to see the wolf pup still right behind him. Sorry," Keith said, "but I have to go now. You should go home too." He continued walking, and the pup followed. He turned around again. "I said, go home. Your family's probably worried about you," he lectured. The pup sneezed, but stayed put. Keith reached the edge of the forest area, and the pup was still there. It gazed up at him, the epitome of the puppy dog eyes. With a sigh, Keith crouched down and scratched under its chin. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Do you not have anywhere else to go?" He had a thought. It was unusual that a star wolf so young was out on its own. They were rare, but it had to come from somewhere. Maybe it had been separated from its pack and didn't know how to return. If that was the case, leaving it here to fend for itself would be like asking for another predator to eat it. "Well," Keith smiled, "let's hope none of my friends are allergic to dogs." Lance supposed there were pros and cons to being the Avatar. Pro, you get to bend all the elements and have other cool powers. Con, everybody expects you to solve all their problems. Pro, you have the power and influence and the ear of the nation's leaders. Con, you might have to fight those leaders to save the world. Apparently, one more pro was that super cool, super adorable, magical animals flock to you like you're a fairy tale princess. To be fair, Keith was definitely pretty enough to be a fairy tale princess, but Lance figured it was more the whole Avatar thing. That was why Keith had returned to camp with a pouch full of berries and a furry new friend. And of course, everyone had immediately started fawning over the puppy, Lance included, as Keith explained what had transpired. Now they were all huddled around the Avatar, who held the pup in his lap, except for Karan, who was happily munching his berries back inside the tent. Though the pup had allowed everyone to pet him, so far only Keith had been given the privilege of holding him. "Who's the cutest puppy in the world?" cooed Pidge. "You are. Yes, you are." "I thought that celestial wolves had gone extinct," Allura said with sparkling eyes. "No one's seen any in years." "I wonder where he came from," Keith said as he pet the puppy absent-mindedly. Shortly after meeting the pup, they had determined its gender, something Keith apparently hadn't even thought of until then. I didn't see any sign of his pack, and he latched onto me pretty quickly, like he'd been alone for a while or something. Allura hummed thoughtfully. It is possible that he was separated from his pack and imprinted on you as the first being to show kindness. She paused, with a mysterious smile. But I have another theory. What's that? Keith asked, and Keith and the wolf pup both tilted their heads at the airbender. Lance almost combusted from the cuteness. I think he's your animal guide. Allura clapped her hands with delight. My what? A spiritual guide that helps you on your avatar's journey. Every avatar has one, and they can be any animal, magical or otherwise. Traditionally, the avatar meets and bonds with their guide early in life, but then your circumstances were anything but traditional. She shrugged. It's also a bit strange that you got a celestial wolf, as the animals are usually native to the nation the avatar was born in. For example, I believe the last avatar from the Fire Nation had a dragon. Keith stared down at the pup in wonder. Well, I guess that means we're stuck with the little guy. Lance said brightly, as he ruffled the fur on top of the wolf pup's head. The pup let out a yip as if in agreement. So what are you going to name him? Keith blinked. Won't he just tell me his name when he's ready? He pouted at everyone snickering. Why? You're adorable, Lance told him, only half teasing. But no, you should probably give him a name. Keith looked down at the pup in his lap, who returned his gaze with unblinking eyes. Maybe the pup really was communicating with his new master somehow. Because after a moment, Keith spoke confidently. Cosmo, he said, a soft smile on his face. His name is Cosmo.